Welcome to Biostasis Technologies podcast. Today we have Professor Susan Schneider, American philosopher and artificial intelligence expert, and author of an excellent book I recommend called Artificial You, AI and the Future of Your Mind. Susan is the founding director of the Center for the Future of Mind at Florida State Atlantic University, where she also holds the William F. Dietrich Distinguished Professorship and a bunch of other titles that you can see in the written version of the introduction here. So welcome, Susan. Thanks for coming.
Hey, Max. Thanks for having me. It's good to finally chat.
Yeah, so we have a lot of commonalities, but probably some philosophical differences too, so this should be fun. So let's start off, before we get to AI topics, AGI and consciousness and personal identity, all those issues, let's just start off first of all to get your perspective, because I'm less familiar with this, on life extension in general. And in particular, well, let's just about life extension. Are you generally in favor of extending the maximum human lifespan, obviously in good health, which should go without saying?
Oh, yeah. I've been a transhumanist since high school. So I was actually an extroprian. I was on that listserv. And I'm incredibly interested in these issues. And I really do hope that, in particular, we have good health spans and that we focus on equitable distribution of the benefits of science and improvement of the quality of one's life. And yes, hopefully the quantity, right?
Right, because that makes
Yeah.
so much else possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah,
We have
it
this
would be
ridiculous
super
situation right
exciting.
now where as we get older and wiser, hopefully we end up declining in vitality at the same time, which is a ludicrous situation.
I think about that a lot because I think the younger generations, they're not experiencing life the way, people do when they're older. And I think it does give you wisdom. That's been
Hmm.
my own experience. And yeah, it's sad when we lose somebody who is particularly important to us
Hmm.
personally or to science or philosophy. Like we just lost Daniel Dennett,
Yeah,
which was
he's one who should have been
heartbreaking.
preserved. Yeah,
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
yes. So obviously, these are issues close to my heart, and my hope is that with these new developments in artificial intelligence, we have more scientific discoveries, and I think we will.
Hmm.
And this could be a really great time.
Now let's get your views on biostasis. And by the way, I prefer the term biostasis to cryonics because it's a more general category, which includes chemical preservation, other possible methods. So we're not necessarily committed to one particular approach. I know you mentioned the Kim Swosey case of the 23-year-old young woman who wanted to be a neuroscientist and ironically got a brain cancer, glioblastoma. So you talk a bit about that. So what are your views on either the current state of biostasis or the possible future state? Do you think this is a reasonable method for preserving personal identity?
Right. Okay. So more reasonable than brain uploading. And I think in particular, if now I'm not an expert by any stretch on all the new innovations at all. So I'm just kind of going to tackle it as a philosopher and say that when, say, you have a cryogenic freezing that preserves a good deal of the brain, let's suppose that's possible. Kim's case was tricky, right?
Yeah,
But
that
if
was
you have
very
that
far from ideal.
revival, it was far from ideal, and it was a very sad case. And it was hard to write about even. And I remember thinking a lot about it because the New York Times had reached out for an interview about her case, and I lost
Right.
sleep over it. Being a mom, and
Mm.
you know, but anyway, if the person's revived and the cells, the neurons and synaptic connections are well preserved, then, personal identity is an incredibly nuanced issue. You know this, you did a dissertation on it, Max.
Yeah.
So, but assuming there is such a thing as a continuity of a self over time, I think that there's a real hope there that as this technology continues, it develops ways that the individual could actually be revived. Now, in Kim's case, sadly, a lot of the brain tissue itself was damaged. And so the hope, I believe, was that neuroscience would sort of at some point be advanced enough to remedy that, and it's just not clear if one could ever do that. I mean, if it's through uploading, I'm much more worried, right?
Right,
About the
right. Yeah, we'll
actual
talk about that. Yeah.
preservation. We can talk about that. And I think when we blend the cryogenics and the uploading cases together, which I think Kim's case was sort of like that, at least in the discussions, uh, then you get into some tricky details philosophically. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, in these cases, as I point out to people, as I talked about in my dissertation, the idea of partial survival, it may be that the question isn't will she survive or will not survive. It's very binary. Maybe it's a matter of degree. Maybe there'll be enough of her that we counted the same person, but a lot of damage. There's really a matter of degree, and beyond a certain point, in Parfit's view, basically you want sufficient psychological connectedness and continuity, and obviously that comes in degrees. And I'm somewhat hopeful about Kim's case just because, it looked like a lot of her brain was killed by the cancer, but just a few days before she was cryopreserved, she was talking and had memories and, it was pretty much there. And cases where people are missing large parts of their brain
Oh, yeah.
and still have, consciousness and personality. And it certainly compromised the quality of the cryoprotection as well. But even if there are areas of the brain that weren't fully perfused, that means we need a lot more repair done. But so long as we can infer the structure that should be there from what remains, it seems like there's at least the possibility that we could reconstruct that. So
I agree. I mean, I think this is something that's very important that we work on. It could be something that benefits not just the select few eventually, it could benefit humanity as a whole, right? These methods. And so I think it's great. I just think, yeah, I feel so bad for Kim. I thought that there was some damage to the brain right before she died that, would preclude a full revival. Now, the personal identity point, I love it that you're thinking exactly of these Derek Parfit issues. And one thing I just want to raise is because, as you know, there's no easy answer philosophically to the problem of personal identity, and there's so many different theories. And for example, some people believe in the continuity of the self in a really rich metaphysical sense, right? They might believe in the soul, for example, or they just might be agnostic and believe that the self literally continues. And other people are more inclined toward a sort of Parfit or Buddha position in which there's not technically a real metaphysical self there. And I think the important thing is that the public be aware so that people making choices about preservation and about uploading and all these issues have the information before them. And what I don't like, and I know you don't do this, but some transhumanists could, especially the ones in, technology where there's a profit to be had and, they're out on Twitter and, they can make very strong claims promising survival, or promising other things without really getting into the philosophical nuances. And that's where it bothers me because I just don't want, our kind of public philosophical views to lack nuance. And I want the public to be looped in to the different positions on these issues.
Right. Philosophy is practical. Philosophy can save your life or it can kill you if it's done badly.
Yeah, that's what I always tell my students. That, metaphysics can be a matter of life and death, right?
Yeah.
But I agree. I mean, Parfit very well could be right. I always joke around that 2 days a week, I agree with Parfit. Who knows, right?
I want to come back to I want to come back to Parfit's views in a little bit because one of your arguments against the uploading idea, I have a different perspective on, but we'll come to that in a little while.
Okay.
Now, on your view, I think given what I understand of your view, I can assume that. So you just said basically that a cryopreservation approach, assuming it preserves memories, is perfectly fine philosophically. Presumably, then any other method like a chemical preservation method, which also preserve the neural structure would be good, except with the caveat that most of the people in favor of chemical preservation tend to be uploaders, and I know you don't think that's a path to survival, which we'll get to soon. So presumably you don't mind the method so long as it's actually preserving the structures. Okay.
Yeah, I tend to be more substrate relative. I have a chapter actually in Artificial You about how I think it's asking the question of whether data could survive over time and, lieutenant commander data, and whether survival is at the level of the robot instantiation on the assumption that it's conscious, right? That
Mm-hmm.
the entity is conscious, or at the level of program type, right? And so I think it's really important to get into the nuances of the type versus the token. So when you're uploading, in a
Absolutely.
way, you're reproducing the type into another instantiation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, having mentioned the commander data, I have to note that in the next generation, I stopped watching after the first season of the next generation, but one of the episodes there, they encounter an old spacecraft from like the 21st century, and it turns out there's, I think, 3 or 4 people cryopreserved on the spaceship. And Picard is frankly a bit of an ass. He says, "Oh, just let them fall into the sun." Whereas Data actually disobeys a direct order and rescues them, and it works. They're brought back to life, so it shows cryopreservation working.
Oh,
So it
I
was
forgot.
bizarre that Picard was just gonna let them die like that. But anyway,
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's
yeah.
not good.
Yeah. Let's talk about current AI now. Everybody's talking about AI these days, and they seem to not make a distinction often between current systems, generally large language models and that kind of approach, and AI in general, which is obviously a broader concept. And in fact, we've back in philosophy, back in the 80s and 90s, there's a lot of discussion about sort of symbolic approach versus a connectionist approach. So there are different ways of doing this. Ray Kurzweil talks about emulating the brain, which obviously be a very different approach. So with that said, that today's AI isn't necessarily the only kind of AI. Do you think that, I mean, there's obviously some discussion of this online, do you think that current systems of AI are in any way conscious? And if so, why? Or if not, why not?
Great question, Max. Very timely. So I think you're right on the money in distinguishing between different kinds of AI when you ask the question. So you already distinguished between large language models, which, as you know, are descended from those connectionist systems we used to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
and symbolic systems. So we know that that's an important distinction. And it could be that a certain type of AI is conscious and others are not. And I don't know how to answer the question except but to talk about different cases, right? Because, like, just yesterday, there was a report of, I believe it was called monkey brain or something. It was a Chinese system that was neuromorphic and could actually run an emulation of an entire monkey brain. And that blew me away. It's said to be the most sophisticated, neuromorphic computer out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you get into neuromorphic computers, and just to be clearer, so in this case, I don't know the details. They didn't actually reveal all the details, but you have probably something that's silicon based. So it's not that it's cellular, although there are those kinds of computers. I'll call those biocomputers, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But the neuromorphic ones are designed to be much more like the actual functioning of the brain. They're not purely digital. They have analog components, for example. They have spiking frequencies and whatnot. Now, of course, as you get closer and closer to the brain, I think it becomes more compelling that the systems could have that capacity for consciousness. And
Mm-hmm.
that's because we can already tell that the brain has that capacity, right?
At
So,
least for our own individual case, and
yeah,
presumably
for
if
our
it
own
not solves
case,
this for other people.
exactly. And, when it comes to the case of others, in the case of non human animals included, it's all just inference to the best explanation. And we're very comfortable with that. We don't
Yeah.
question that an animal could feel pain any longer. Thank God science has got to the point where,
Mm.
it's clear that they can feel pain and we protect them. Uh, you know, so we know that inference to the best explanation is an adequate methodology for extending legal protections to beings that can be conscious. And I think, we have to also do that with respect to AI, divide it up into cases and consider and run tests. So, that's where I think it's very important to run tests. So anyway, the neuromorphic case I think is pretty compelling. I'm not saying that we should say that these entities are conscious. I think that we need to run tests on them and be very cautious
Mm.
about those issues, and also consider AI safety concerns. But I also think that an even more important case, because it's even closer to the biological case, are these biocomputers. So
Mm.
you could have an organoid based computer there are some being sold right now in Australia, for example. In the future, you could wire more and more of these systems together so that they emulate the brain, for example. And as you do that, because you're starting with brain organoids already, the case there is strong that there's some consciousness. Now, we can't, though, think that it's going to be like us. I mean, this whole issue is going to be super nuanced and super difficult. Now, if you want me to talk about LLMs, I will. I'm more confident in my views on LLMs. Do you want me to turn to that?
Yeah.
Or you wanna...
Yeah.
Okay. So the LLM case first off, the first move is to divide that into instantiation cases. So if we're talking about an LLM instantiated by GPUs, that's one thing. Now, it turns out that the system in China actually is capable of running DeepSeek for inference, so it wasn't used for training. And then you're getting into LLM instantiations that are neuromorphic. Similarly, you could have, in principle, an LLM instantiation that's a biocomputer, though I don't think, that I think that would be hard to implement right now, given our
that'd be pretty tough given the way they process.
You could connect it together with an organoid system, right? And then you have a sort of hybrid system. And I think hybrid systems are also really interesting cases. But anyway, let's talk about just the kind of standard LLM case. Let's assume that the systems, you never know, but I mean, we've been told that OpenAI's system isn't, neuromorphic. Same with Claude. These are impressively smart systems. Are they conscious? I mean, they certainly tell us they are at various points, and God knows I get enough emails from users. OpenAI really needs to do something about that. And anyway, I don't think that we have any evidence to believe that those are conscious right now. I think I've advanced what I call an error theory about those cases based on what I call the collective neocortex view. So that says, I'll keep it short because I'm already, but it basically, we have something that explains away their avowals of consciousness. So their avowals of consciousness, their claims, can't be used as evidence for or against. So we're still in need of good tests, good solid tests, before we conclude that LLMs instantiated by GPUs are genuinely conscious.
And would you say that the Turing test is not a good test?
Well, the Turing test was just designed to do something entirely different. It was about fooling, users into thinking that something's human, right? It wasn't peering inside of the mind of the intelligent entity. So I think it's an entirely different ballgame. First of all, something can pass a Turing test but not have any consciousness, right? Yeah, and second of all, something could fail a Turing test and be conscious. So something that's non-linguistic could be conscious, for example, something that doesn't behave in a human-like fashion, right? So that's not the right approach.
Well, someone who can't process speech properly, maybe they can think the ideas, but there's something wrong with their speech centers and they can't convince people.
That's exactly right. And so, the Turing test isn't going to do it.
It's really based on behaviorism, I think, right? It's come before more modern views of consciousness. It's basically a behaviorist view, which nobody really, as far as I can tell, accepts these days.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a valuable test, I'll tell you, in a lot of ways, because I like the way that Turing didn't get bogged down in how to define consciousness. And he said, these philosophers, these scientists are never going to agree on a definition of intelligence, and let's get a test. And it was a good test for, everyday purposes concerning machine intelligence, although now we know that there are all kinds of other tests we can give them. We can give them theory of mind tests, for example. I mean, there are all kinds of tests out there. But I think similarly for consciousness, if we sit there and fight as philosophers, which we'll all do, about how to define it and whatnot, we're not going to get anywhere. And what we need are just working tests. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the issue, as you know, is incredibly urgent, right? But I don't think we should seek a singular test for every type of AI, for every case, right? We have to
Right.
let as
Yep.
many flowers bloom as possible, given the intrinsic differences between kinds of AIs, like linguistic, non-linguistic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, one thing I really liked in your book was that rather than sort of just dealing with Seoul's Chinese room, which everybody has to tackle that one, you actually provide a number of different tests. You've got the ACT, the AI consciousness test, the chip test, and the test inspired by integrated information processing theory of consciousness. Now, I don't know if we can cover all of those, but can you touch on one or more of those as to how you could practically actually test an AI for consciousness?
Right. Okay. So the ACT test, which was devised with a dear friend, astrophysics professor at Princeton, Edwin Turner, we decided that one way to test linguistic AIs is to simply ask them philosophical questions. Give them the Mary thought experiment. Test them in a range of cases involving the felt quality of experience. Even ask them about films like Freaky Friday, where someone body
Mm-hmm.
swaps with their mother, right? See if they get
Yeah.
cases of disembodiment. See if they mourn the death of a loved one. I mean, now, of course, this is all very anthropomorphic, but Ed and I knew that if something passed the act, that it would only be a sufficient condition for consciousness. And we said that from the get-go. We never pretended that it would be a necessary condition. And we also said that not every type of system would be a candidate for the ACT test, including AIs that have been exposed to human data. So that
Right.
means today's LLMs, which have crawled so much data involving consciousness and the brain, can't be subjects for the test. You would
Right.
really have to you could give it to LLMs, and
But they just go out and search to see how would an AI answer this convincingly, and how has it been done in science fiction or
absolutely.
something? Yeah.
I mean, but at the level of R&D, the AI companies themselves could give the test before they exposed the system to
Mm-hmm.
too much data. And some people criticize me and say, I call that boxing in the AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
And giving it the act. They say, well, Susan, as soon as it's exposed to data, nothing about your test says anything about the LLM. And my response is, actually, if you get a positive result, that's amazing, right? Even if it's a smaller LLM that hasn't been exposed to all the data, because
Mm-hmm.
that would show that something of that type is capable of consciousness. And you wouldn't think that once it has even more information, its consciousness would necessarily recede. Although it
Right.
might. I mean, when it starts sort of self-modifying,
Mm-hmm.
or when the engineers get to it, they might decide to minimize conscious experience in it, sure. But it would be amazing to know if an LLM was capable of that kind of experience. That would teach us something very important. Consciousness can extend beyond the biological brain.
Yeah. And then you had the chip test.
Sure. Yeah, the chip test
Yeah.
was just simply a suggestion that those people working on brain chips, as they begin to replace or augment parts of the brain responsible for consciousness, like working
Mm-hmm.
memory and attention, if you, in a range of tests, including individual reports, saw consciousness functioning properly, you could infer that the chip was capable of instantiating consciousness, at least in the context of a larger biological system. And that would be another example of how, say, something of the chip substrate, like silicon in the right configuration,
Mm-hmm.
could actually serve as the right stuff for consciousness. And that would be a very important indication that machine consciousness was possible. And it would also illustrate that the extended consciousness view is also quite feasible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if something could be put in the head that instantiates consciousness, it could just as easily be 3 feet away from the head and be a case of extended consciousness, which is,
Right.
something Andy Clark has been poking around. Well, more than poke, he's been defending the extended mind view with David Chalmers for years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be amazing if we learned that consciousness, not just cognition, could be extended.
Right. One thing I think sometimes is we are taking very much a human-centric point of view here. We're looking at AIs and judging whether they have consciousness. It could be that not too far in the future, AIs will be looking at us and judging us. Are humans really conscious? Are they kind of faking it? I have real consciousness, but humans actually aren't really conscious mostly, right? We're 99% not conscious. There's a lot going on under the surface that we're not aware of, that we can't really become aware of. Like, we're especially bad at emotional understanding because we don't have many pathways going back from the emotional centers from the consciousness to the emotional. It's built for survival, really, to feel something, sense the lion coming, feel this fear, run. We don't really have pathways going back, letting us deal with anxiety or rage or anxiety. So, AIs could be a lot more sophisticated, could have, I know you don't like the term higher levels of consciousness, and that's kind of an awful term, but a richer level of layers of complexity, which humans may not have. So they may actually question whether we're conscious very much or minimally
I
conscious.
agree entirely. I mean, I think we tend to have this kind of mental hierarchy where we're putting ourselves on top of the ladder of conscious beings because on Earth we happen to be the most intelligent beings that we know of. And I think this kind of anthropomorphic view is going to fall apart. As AI gets smarter and smarter, we're going to realize that we're not necessarily the most intelligent beings. And by analogy, we may not be the most capable of consciousness. It could be that a human could augment and have a sort of hyperconscious experience the way that Ray Kurzweil envisioned, right? I mean, that would be amazing if we could see some of these transhumanist ideas actually come to fruition. And similarly, it could be that, you're absolutely right. Most of the mental processing that a human does is not even conscious or even accessible to consciousness in principle. Like much of the visual system itself is just not accessible to consciousness. For example, the cerebellum, and so it could be that there's a hyper-conscious species relative to us. And we already know with the case of the octopus that consciousness could look very different. I mean, the octopus has arms, that's what they're called, and they each seem to be capable of initiating action without consulting anything like a central executive in the brain, an attentional mechanism. So they made themselves have consciousness. Those areas within the arms are capable of a lot of intelligent action. So, I think we are going into an amazing territory when it comes to the study of consciousness. It's going to be incredible. And of course, the AIs will be giving us information about consciousness as well, which will be mind-blowing, I suspect.
Yeah. It's funny mentioning octopuses. It reminds me of something when I was CEO of Alcor. Someone called up and said they had a pet octopus, and did we charge by the tentacle? Something like that. It was a joke call, but I thought that was kind of funny actually, because
That's pretty funny.
do have different levels of thinking in each different parts of it. So not
Yeah,
actually, they thought they were being funny, but actually maybe it was a fairly sensible question.
right. So could you like cheap out on your pet octopus and just like preserve one tentacle? Gosh, or cheap out on a human and just preserve a hemisphere.
Yeah. Let's just, because it's relevant to a lot of these topics, let's briefly touch on the distinction between simulation and emulation. And these terms don't seem to be well defined in what I've come across, but at least vaguely, my understanding is a simulation is the kind of thing that would pass a Turing test. It's basically something that behaves in the right way. You ask it questions, it can give the right kind of answers. It can, and if you give it a robot body, it could do things that would suggest from the outside that it's conscious. But an emulation requires a bit more than that. It requires basically simulation at a deeper level. So I think there's not a rigid distinction here. So then the question becomes, well, what level do we need to simulate? Like for a human brain, if we wanted to have, let's assume that we're not going to say, well, silicon definitely can't be conscious. Let's assume maybe it can. But at what level would we have to emulate that? Would we have to emulate the connections of the neurons, the chemistry of the synapses, the biology of the mitochondria inside the nucleus of the cells? I mean, what level, and how would we answer that question? Or does it go back to the tests that we've already discussed?
Oh yeah, great question. I've been thinking a lot about that lately, Max. I mean, so by simulation versus emulation, you mean the emulation would itself be conscious. So not just
Right.
a sort of coarse-grained simulation that maybe like an LLM that could give, functional behaviors that could be human-like.
Right. So
But in fact,
neuromorphic, but at
something,
what level are we talking about?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
great. Okay. So it could be subneural, Max. I mean, I think myself, I'm actually inclined to think that you would need to go beneath the neuron and actually go to the quantum level and look at the properties there. You would need to, I have a paper out, coming out in the Journal of Consciousness Studies as a target paper. It's already on the web, called Superpsychism, which is a defense of the resonance theory, but also a defense of what I call the prototype interpretation of quantum mechanics, which Mark Bailey and myself wrote. So it is based on sort of a particular view of quantum coherence and space-time emergence. And I think when you put all this stuff together, you do get a picture of the mind, which is that the mind's conscious capacity comes in virtue of its quantum properties as they decohere. So I'm writing a paper now called Quantum Darwinism in the Brain, which is using the quantum Darwinist approach that is influential in physics to explain how this could be the case. But it goes beyond just the hammer-off stuff, which I love. I love Stewart's work. And
I was just
I
going to
think the
bring that up. Yeah.
microtubule stuff, I think it's super
Right.
cool. I just was at his conference last year, and wow, that was fun. I was one of their keynotes. Boy, that's a conference to go to.
That's a fun conference, yeah.
Tucson,
Yeah.
oh my God. Yeah. So anyway, I think all that's really important. I don't know why it's tied though so strongly to Roger Penrose's theory of gravity, and I don't think it should be. I actually differ from Roger on some of this stuff, but anyway, the upshot is that there's a lot of commonly held views in physics that when you put them all together lead straight to the view that consciousness actually happens from the very rock bottom level and has to do with the delicate dance of decoherence and interaction between the previously entangled states and new entanglements at the level of many bodies. So it has to do with times arrow emerging too. And then when you get to that point, you get a really interesting kind of effect, which produces consciousness. So, I think that, I'll be talking about this more, and I'm looking forward to the responses to the JCS special issue. But anyway, I don't want to get too lost in that. That's the thing I'm working on right now. I find it incredibly exciting. But I think that's what's going on with consciousness. So I think that the subneural level is hot. And I think that the neuromorphic stuff in AI is also of great interest to me for that reason, to see if it instantiates something that could give rise, upon decoherence, some sort of similar pattern. And to me, the pattern ultimately at the level of neurodynamics is a kind of resonance pattern. And it starts at the resonance at the level of quantum entanglement, though, on my view.
Do you think that's essentially tied to biology, or could that be something that a different substrate could also handle?
I'm open. I'm entirely open, and I think that's the scientific question right now. I think we also have to bear in mind that consciousness can be multiply realized. So it could be that just because there's a story with microtubules, maybe, and resonant interactions between the different areas of the brain in humans, it could be instantiated differently in AIs. So that's why tests become so important, right? And it would be inhumane for us to proceed anthropomorphically. But I also think it's inhumane for us to overextend our classification of what's conscious too early. And I'm happy to talk about that. Right.
Yeah, I like your sort of open perspective in the book that we can't decide all these answers now. People want to have certainty and be told what's right and wrong, but we really just don't know at this stage. It's a long way ahead of us before we can figure these things out, if we ever do. Here's one of the big questions.
Yeah.
Right, we have we have the consciousness is a hard problem, as David Chalmers calls it. But my thought is maybe it's not a hard problem. Maybe it's an impossible problem. Maybe it's just a brute fact about the universe that we can't actually really explain. We can sort of correlate it with all kinds of physical effects, but maybe it's just that it's like some kind of emergent property that you just can't scientifically explain. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a good analogy, but why is the speed of light the way it is? Why would it be something different?
And that does constitute a solution. If we find out, for example, if we find out that consciousness is brute, either at the kind of emergent level, although I don't tend to think of brute properties as emergent ones, or at that fundamental level, it just is right there with the fundamental laws that themselves may lack an explanation.
Yeah.
Then that's fine. Explanation has to begin somewhere, but it gives us a rich sense of how to deal with these cases. And it gives us an answer to the problem of consciousness that at least tells us what's metaphysically basic, although it's not a full explanation. So yeah, I mean, I'd be happy with that, actually.
Yeah.
I'd be thrilled. I do suspect that we can we can locate fundamentality through inference to the best explanation. I mean, that's what I do in the Super Psychism paper with Mark Bailey. We argued that we can infer that consciousness is basic by taking a number of different important theories, putting them together and saying this is the best explanation for a range of quantum phenomena as well as consciousness. So we take space-time emergence, for example. We assume that.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I want to live a lot longer is because we're not going to answer some of these questions for a long time. And I want to be here when we do have answers. I want to be here when we unify quantum gravity and with the rest of physics and so on. There's just so much to learn that being dead is very boring.
I know, but I think that, I mean, I feel better now that I've had a chance to really think about these issues. I think it's clear that space-time is emergence. To me it is. And I don't mean to say that I'm certain that string theory is right versus loop quantum gravity, but I think at this point, after having thought this through, it looks to me like there's enough of a convergence suggesting that space-time's emergent. I just don't see how otherwise you would have phenomena like spooky action at a distance. I think the only way quantum non-locality could be happening is if there's no distance metric at the very fundamental level.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's no distance.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's something like time, but it's time without its arrow. Yeah. I mean, I think if you just sit down and look at quantum phenomena like superposition and delayed choice and all this crazy stuff, it does seem very strongly like there's no space-time metric when you have states in a pure state. And when they're entangled like that,
it may be
entropy zero. The von Neumann entropy of a entangled system in a pure state is zero, and when time's arrow applies, that's when you get entropy. So I think those states are timeless, and as they decohere, that's where you get time with its arrow. It's really fun to think
philosophy
about.
of time is itself a big, interesting topic.
Oh, it's a blast. I mean, I'm a metaphysician at heart, so I've had days where I just locked myself away and thought about this stuff. I love that stuff. That's the best. I sort of wish the AI stuff would just go away. I mean,
it's a bit all-consuming right now. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. It's dreadful. Yes, and it's just all the bad actors I have to worry about.
It may be that talking about understanding the basic nature of the universe or of consciousness, it seems possible. We don't want to believe this, but it might be possible that a human brain could never understand it, which then kind of leads to the question of, can we integrate with artificial intelligence? Can we augment ourselves in various ways? And I know you've written quite a bit about that and how we could change ourselves, and how generally that seems like there's a lot of advantages to that, but also some possible dangers with it. But that could be the case, right? Maybe our AIs can understand things, but maybe we just don't have the cognitive categories to make sense of what they tell us. So we could maybe never understanding it. Given these squishy 3-pound pieces of meat, we may need something better than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll better understand it as we begin to augment too. And that's going to get really, really interesting. I mean, we already have like cases in nature. So there's the case of the Craniopagus twins who have conjoined thalamus. They have a thalamic bridge in particular. I hope they're doing well. I try to follow them. That, you know, it's hard. They have a lot of physical and brain problems. But that case really taught me a lot because it was entirely possible given the fact that they had that novel neuroanatomical structure. So they're conjoined at the head and they have a bridge connecting their respective thalamuses, that they could have the same conscious experience because they're connected in that way, and they do. So one could be looking away and the other could eat peanut butter and the other will taste it. So there's just been a range of tests that make it clear that they share, you know, their attentional mechanism, and that. So I think that there will be all kinds of interesting cases that come up once we start augmenting in these rich ways, right? Really deep, and connecting humans and computers. Yeah.
I think actually already a lot of interesting cases, which show clearly that, you know, Descartes was wrong and the mind is not this simple, transparent thing. I'm sure you've read Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, looking at all the different kinds of agnosias and bizarre things that intuitively think that can't be possible, but in fact it is, that you can see shapes but you can't actually recognize objects, or that, you know, the alien hand syndrome, my favorite name of any syndrome, the alien hand syndrome, sounds very scary, that you can't actually relate to your hand, or hemispheric neglect, where you don't believe part of your body belongs to you. These are very strange things that you can't explain by Cartesian consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that for me, reading books like Michael Gazzaniga's cognitive neuroscience textbooks and Oliver Sacks, that made a huge difference to my understanding of the self, right? And consciousness, that it really has these crazy dissociations, and yeah. And so we're in for a really interesting ride. You know, it could be that, I mean, being a panpsychist, I'm very open to the possibility that everything's conscious just to a small degree, and that when you have complex systems that are well integrated, you get consciousness. So maybe it will turn out there'll be all sorts of conscious AIs. You never know, right? But I did want to mention that because of the very real possibility of over attributing consciousness, we have to be very careful too, because, you know, I'm sure you know all about trolley problems, and many of your listeners have thought of cases of ethical trade-offs where, say, you have, you know, 5 AIs on one side of the track, 1 human baby on the other, and we're wrong that the AIs just act conscious, but they're not, and we kill the baby. You know, we just have to be really careful to get those tests developed so that we can have as much certainty as possible about what's conscious and what's not.
Yeah, we want to have robot servants. We don't want to have robot slaves.
Right. You know, it's going to get tricky. I mean, we want to make sure too that, you know, and say we have an LLM and it's a mixture of experts model, and only one expert is conscious and the rest aren't. Do we have to test just that one? And we have to make judgments that protect that one, right? But the total system may only have a very small amount of consciousness, and it might be intermittent depending on whether that expert is activated. And, you know, we might just want to engineer future systems so that we don't have these kinds of dilemmas. You know, I mean, why, until humans are properly taken care of, I think we should scientifically develop an understanding of AI consciousness, but not necessarily proliferate it all over the universe. Right?
I think in your book also you made, I think, that, you know, the sensible practical point that companies developing AI don't want to open themselves to lawsuits that they're, you know, tormenting conscious beings, so they should make it pretty clear that these are not conscious, not even try to make them, you know, too similar to a human consciousness, because that's going to get them into probably legal problems and, you know, public rejection if they're plausibly conscious.
I'm also worried, though, you know, conversely, that AI consciousness could be used to sort of shrug off any responsibility. It's like, oh, it's autonomous, it's conscious. Sorry, we're not responsible for that. It's responsible for itself. right? So I think lawyers are going to have to be very savvy. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why I think it's neat that there's so much policy interest in this issue, because we have to really watch out to make sure that everything goes in a way that's right for
Mm-hmm.
human flourishing, and also the flourishing of the wider range of sentient beings, as well as the environment. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these data centers worry me.
No, they just need to be run on nuclear power. Solves the problem.
Do you think that the nuclear power, though, like these smaller modules,
Mm-hmm.
are truly safe? I mean, I don't really know enough about that issue to know if they would be safe from tampering, and or whether they would endanger the communities that are nearby.
I think they're pretty safe, but I don't want to sort of make a declaration about that because I'm not an expert on those
Yeah.
particular systems. I think regular nuclear power stations are I don't like to say that they're safe because that's like an absolute yes or no thing. I think they're a lot safer than any other power source if you look at the actual numbers. I mean, people just don't understand this. They think nuclear power is you kill lots of people. They think 3 Mile Island was a massive disaster. It actually killed 0 people. Even something as stupid as Chernobyl, which probably should never happen here because nobody else designs it without a containment building, use a graphite moderated water cooled reactor. It's a really stupid combination. But even that actually, relative to things like dam bursts and other things, didn't do so much damage. So I can see the practical reasons for the smaller ones, but I actually think that the larger ones would be fine, and they're actually heavily overregulated because of foolish ideas like the linear no threshold approach, which basically means the safer you make it, the more they raise the regulatory standards, and so it becomes more and more expensive. So we never get affordable nuclear power. Anyway, that's another topic which I can
Wow, it
go
sounds
on.
like you actually know a lot about it. I really appreciate that, Max. I appreciate
Yeah,
that a lot.
yeah.
Yeah, that's useful to know about. Well, I mean, that's also a reason why there's increased interest in neuromorphic computing, because it saves energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so all the more reason for us to understand the consciousness question.
Mm-hmm. I'm very curious as to, I don't know if this has been resolved yet. Maybe it has. Well, I haven't been looking. But when DeepSeek first came out and did really well, supposedly at vastly lower cost and much lower computational power, but then other people say, well, that's only because they based it on work done for other AI systems. I don't know if that was resolved or if that really is a path to massively reducing the amount of computational power and energy required. But I do think there's obviously going to be strong incentives to move in that direction because these things do chew up a lot of power, and that is expensive.
Yeah, I mean, these are very interesting questions, and it would be really nice if, you know, the cyber wars would just stop, because I think, if you have to have data centers designed to clean up data because, you know, each country's poisoning the web, right? I mean, the web's being ruined and poisoned right now because of all this.
Well, it
And,
has it has been from the very beginning, though. I don't really panic about that because I think it's if you look on the very early internet forums, there's plenty of crap there. So,
yeah.
it's kind of an arms race, right? We have to. It's just like with spam calls. They weren't a problem
Oh,
when people first had phone calls, and now they're a big problem for some people. But then there's technology that comes up to help you deal with that. So it's always an arms race, and we're still very much obviously in a rapidly changing situation. So we haven't quite caught up yet. But
yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
No, this is the kind of the obligatory question, and feel free to turn it down. But what do you see as a plausible timeline for achieving artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence? Because some people are saying, in a couple of years, like Scott Alexander, he's saying probably by 2027 we'll have real true AGI. Others are saying that's ridiculous. It's going to be far longer than that. Do you have a view
Oh,
on that?
yeah, I laid it out recently in a new paper called oh, I forgot the name of it. Well, it's on my website under papers. It's coming out in Dialectica as a special issue target paper, and a bunch of people are
Uh-huh.
writing replies. It I think it's called From Large Language Models to Superintelligence or something like that. Okay,
Okay.
so I don't think it's a good idea to focus on AGI. I think it's a misleading idea, in the sense that what is usually meant is something like a functional isomorph or a near isomorph of a human. But today's large language models are already savants relative to us. So
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to dim them down to produce AGI. They're just, AI is just going to eventually be smarter than us in more and more respects. So I think it could get to superintelligence without hitting the AGI marker. And I think AI safety experts need to watch this issue because I think the savant systems are themselves, that's what I call them, the ones like LLMs, that have the potential for great catastrophe. So I think we will get to superintelligence. The only one thing I would say is we may not get conscious AI, so it wouldn't necessarily be technical superintelligence, where superintelligence is what is able to outmode humans in every respect. But I don't think we'll ever have AGI unless somebody is building a museum or something and they want to create just like a person. But I think we already have very sophisticated brain emulations. That would be my guess.
Well, people already kind of limit the definition of AGI to make it easy to achieve by saying basically anything that you could do while sitting in front of a computer. Because obviously, you put an AI out into the garden to do some gardening, it's not going to do a very good job.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was thinking of intellectual tasks and linguistic tasks, and obviously not. But I do think actually that we probably already have something like superintelligence. I think the stuff that is sort of underground, not released, is probably about 6 to 7 years more advanced than what we have released. That's my guess. So maybe there.
Yeah. There's also the issue. So part of the issue there is, Moravec's paradox, right? Things that humans are good at, machines could be bad at, and vice versa. And there's no reason why they have to be like us, like a brilliant version of humans. They could be brilliant in certain areas and not so capable in others. There's also the question, though, of whether superintelligence alone can let you change the world, or destroy all human beings in the eyes of some of the catastrophists. And I actually read that wasn't a new idea. I read a very nice elaborate argument by I forget his name. I'm not very familiar with Dorkesh, I think his name is. He's a podcaster who's really smart guy. He's done some very interesting pieces. I've got to catch up with them. But I read a blog of his quite detailed as to why intelligence alone is not going to allow AI to take over the world. And I had some of the same ideas, and I thought they made a pretty compelling case. Super IQ and super knowledge alone is not going to let you take over the world and destroy all humans, or would necessarily make you want to do that. I mean, why would machines necessarily want to do that, since they don't have an evolutionary background where they have to kill for survival and so on?
Yeah, I think we just don't know. So a clever human can be constrained, can be killed by a lion that's less, So would we succeed in, keeping a super intelligent AI in the box? There are some great tales about that in the EA community, and So I tend to be very cautious as a person. I tend to be worried. What I see right now on the ecosystem, the AI ecosystem, terrifies me. I already see the potential for awful, viruses to be propagated, or information, massive amounts of disinformation. I see the, furthering of the surveillance networks that we all would rather not be part of, right? Digital surveillance and
the panopticon.
It's a giant panopticon, and surveillance capitalism in our context, but in other countries where even when they're not capitalist, they have, surveillance is terrible. It's a terrible thing. And I guess I do really worry about AI safety. And I also worry that if you have a savant system or a super intelligent system, who is in control of that system? And will they do do we know how to really make it safe? Because we couldn't even, humans have made a lot of mistakes with their technology. I'll just say that. And, it seems like with emerging technologies, things go wrong. So
they go wrong with all technology. That's how we learn. Yes. That's how we make things better, is by making mistakes.
The lesson for this case, may not be exactly as Nick Bostrom wrote in his book. So it may not proceed in exactly that fashion, but things could go really wrong. Lately, I've been worrying about like AI megasystems. I've been working a lot with people like Kyle Killian and Mark Bailey. They're in AI safety, and thinking about how AI services themselves will interact with each other, especially given geopolitics and pretty much all the things we've been worrying about seem to be coming true, which is not good, not good at all. Sorry to sound grim.
Well, I think having competing AIs is going to be a really important part of the future, because there's no way we can absolutely guarantee any system is safe. That's why we have, just like in the American system, we're supposed to have a balance of powers, separation of powers, right? So if we have multiple AIs keeping an eye on each other, that'd probably be one possible method. But you mentioned Bostrom, and I don't know if this came from Bostrom or someone else, but the paperclip maximizer idea has always seemed actually quite ludicrous to me. That something could be so smart that it could destroy civilization, but too stupid to realize that maximizing paperclip reduction was a bad idea. That just seems deeply implausible unless you very carefully designed a system to be like that. I think you'd have to do it very deliberately. I don't see how that could really happen by accident. So that particular scenario seems implausible to me.
I hope you're right, Max.
You don't sound so confident.
I don't know. I mean, the AI seem to be mirroring, these large language models seem to be developing a lot of deceptive, bizarre, and quite human-like tactics. So even if they're not ultimately paperclip maximizers, they are being developed in the context of a very adversarial relationship with each other, as well as against the background of our data and then the way we use them. Which, look at like my daughter the other day, she's like, oh my god, my car has grok in it, mom. And so they were just all trying to just mess with it, right? The stuff people throw, we've all done this, and so we're throwing the worst of ourselves at these systems. So
well, I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about. I just think the paperclip maximizing thing in particular is not the one we should be worrying about.
Yeah, that's not the one that keeps me up at night. Yeah. So, the AI safety stuff's awful.
Yeah. Well, let's come around, because we're running short on time, and let's come back to sort of tying a couple of topics together. In personal identity theory. So, people interested in cryonics and biostasis obviously tend to have a lot of interest in personal identity theory compared to the general population, because it's a critical question as to under what circumstances can you be revived and when are you really dead and so on. I also had a whole chapter on what is the definition of death based on personal identity.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I know you're pretty skeptical about the uploading idea, that we could do a destructive brain scan and upload somebody. And I take it that one of the reasons for that is not that you think that non-biological stuff can't possibly be conscious. It seems to be more to do with that you're losing spatial temporal continuity in some way. And you talk about obviously the usual cases of what if we create a copy of you or split you into 2 or 3. But my question there, because I might have missed it because I haven't read every single word, but I didn't notice you discussing Parfit's view, which I also kind of share, that personal identity isn't what matters. What matters is actually psychological connectedness and continuity over time, and that usually goes together with personal identity, at least in most situations that we've experienced so far. Although there are split brain cases and other things like that, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And if they do come apart, to me, if I was to be divided into 2 magically somehow, I would not see that as being one of me dying, being replaced by 2 people. I would see that as me continuing as 2 new individuals. But they're new only in a sense that doesn't really matter. I'm still surviving. It's going to be a problem. I wouldn't want to do that, because which one's going to get my wife? who's going to get my dogs? So there are practical problems. But I would see that as me surviving as 2 new individuals. Now, of course, they're going to diverge, and the more they diverge, the less I'd be willing to give myself up for the other. But to me, that spatial temporal jump isn't necessarily, and I'm not so sure about this. I worry about this because I haven't satisfied myself, but I actually don't have problems with sort of the matter transmission approaches or the division approaches other than the practical issues. Am I right that your main objection to that sort of scenario was lack of spatial temporal continuity?
Yeah, that's certainly one of them. I think Parfit actually kind of gave the very objection to uploading that I raised, or one of them at least, right? Like you could be standing on a scanner and think that your future self, I mean, I'm trying to remember all this. It's been a while, but suppose you have a destructive upload because you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And so you agree that you want to survive through uploading. And so you're going to let them destroy you and measure your brain and then create in a computer an upload of you. And so suppose they do it and that entity, is conscious, suppose, because we have these emulations, not just simulations, but true conscious emulations, and it thinks it's you. And so you might say, well, then, okay, I survive in that case, so let's do it. Let's jump on the scanner. Okay, but the problem, as Parfit, I believe, pointed out, and I hope I'm getting his case more or less right, is that you can also envision, counterfactually, a situation where there wasn't destructive uploading, but just a measurement, sort of like sophisticated MRIs. And that individual then would be still standing there on the scanner. And we would say that's really the same person. And then the new person, I guess you might say, is also the same person, or you want to say, I mean, I'm not sure
There's
what
also
to
a
say
continua.
metaphysically, right?
I call it the Robert Nozick's language. They're both close continuas. That's one way of
Close
putting it.
continuous. Yes. So that is, I mean, throwing out, and Parfit himself, I think, wanted to do this, right? Throwing out the idea of a metaphysical self. So, in other words, there's no true continuity in that sameness of consciousness sense. What there is instead is just what he called psychological continuity, which is just these closest continuous, right? So it could be that that's what's going on, but we have to distinguish it from the case of real survival in that metaphysical sense. Yeah, so my objection is, first off, we just need to distinguish those cases and select a theory as users of, say, we have uploading cases that we can buy, we can upload, we can decide to upload. We just need to think about the situation. And if one then does say, all right, I don't believe in that real self, so I want a closest continuer, and there's no metaphysical survival, fine, upload away, go for it. I'm not going to do it. And I think my objection is more,
What if you were definitely going to die permanently otherwise?
oh, what the hell, do it. I mean, and I do say that it could be that there are other reasons to upload. So, for example, you might want to continue, you might want somebody to carry out your activities. You might want, including being a parent or taking care of elderly parents or whatever, right? Sure. And it can even give you some solace, right? Especially if you're like me, where 2 days a week you sympathize with Parfit, right? I just think we need to get our theories straight. What was bothering me, I think, when I was writing about it, was this idea that the self could literally survive. And, you see this ambiguity, too, in Parfit himself, right? Like in his work. Like when I teach this, I sometimes bring it up. And I just want to get, it's sort of just a matter of correct advertising, I guess. Because I don't think you could cross substrates magically like that. That gets a little weird. But there's the neural replication thought experiment. I mean, there's all kinds of thought experiments of gradual uploading that make it different. It makes it really hard, right? I mean, we could delve into all that. But yeah, hard stuff. As you wrote a whole dissertation on it.
Yeah, I kind of go quite a long way with Parfit, but I think he goes a little too far with the no-self view, because it sort of depends on the framework you put on that, a lot of philosophers may come from the framework of, John Locke and David Hume, and Hume saying how he looked inside himself and couldn't find the self. But of course, that's a silly thing. Of course, you cannot find the self by looking inside. It's not that kind of thing. So, I don't think there's a self in that sense, like a thing you're going to find in there somewhere. That sounds too much like a soul, which I never even understood that concept. I mean, if you get reincarnated, your soul gets reincarnated into a different personality or a different animal. In what sense is that you? In no sense, as far as I'm concerned. But so I think he was a little bit too far with the no self view. But yeah, I don't see metaphysically as a self, which I find it easier to see like an upload version of myself as a continua that would satisfy me. But it's it's very hard because our intuitions are completely stuck in a whole history of being an individual, just one of us. So it's very hard to think about, like, if you divide me into two, how do I think about that? Because that's just not the way things have ever been. Decide is that survival or not? It's really, yes, it's not identity because that breaks down. But if that's not what matters,
it's truly fascinating. And then when you think about it, like we were talking about AI policy and interests now. I think before we got on this together, we were chatting about AI policy, and with these AIs. You get into very crazy cases involving selfhood and persistence. And so I think all these questions are going to come up, and it's going to be very difficult to deal with it with policymakers who don't have that philosophical training and are going to just be like, oh my God, because we philosophers don't even know really how to take care of these questions. We all know that these are really vexing questions. And if anybody comes to us and says that they're confident and they have an answer, we know that they won't put their lives on it.
Yeah. And even politicians who do have some philosophy, I mean, it's kind of frustrating and embarrassing to me, because I have a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford University. But unfortunately, since that time, quite a few British prime ministers have had exactly the same degree, but I don't feel at all confident they have much deep philosophical understanding of anything. So even some formal training doesn't mean politicians are going to think very well about these things.
Yeah, that's a great major. Yeah, I know, and I love talking to people. And, I worked with Congress on AI policy when I was in Washington, and even presented in the mornings at the Capitol building, and I did meet some people who were really into philosophy, and it was really fun. In fact, I saw a friend who just a week ago who was a member of Congress, but yeah, I mean, I think we're all pretty humble together, right? But yeah, the dangerous people are the ones who act like they know what they're talking about.
Yeah. The ones who are so certain of themselves.
Elon Musk, with his tweets about the future of humanity. And, I think we have to be very careful that, all of us are just humble right now in the face of these issues. And so we're on a journey together, and we have to do this right. We have to get it right.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a closing note is, that practical importance of philosophy. Back in, I guess it was probably the 60s, Ayn Rand wrote an essay called "Philosophy: Who Needs It?" And it's not who needs it; it was who needs it. We all do. Very practical. And of course, I've also recently been paying a lot more attention to Stoicism, which I really should have seen more earlier. And Stoicism, of course, is a very practical philosophy of life. Actually, it blends into cognitive behavioral therapy and similar ideas. So it's very practical. And the kind of thinking that we're trying to do about AI and risk and so on is also very philosophical and also very practical in real life. So this idea that philosophy is some kind of abstract discipline that's useless, well, actually, that's largely true. If you look at most of the philosophy done, it is largely useless and just academic, but it's also very powerful and important to understand our world and how to make decisions. So I think it's too bad that schools don't teach philosophy in a more practical sense like that.
I couldn't agree more. And I think fellow philosophers could really help make things better if, when they sat down with policymakers and scientists, they didn't just engage in conceptual pissing matches with each other, excuse me for being blunt, and really started to see that being clear and getting past terminological disagreements to the real stuff would help everybody much more. Because over and over again, I find myself in these policy discussions with people who are just really eager to understand the issues and who get sidetracked by philosophers fighting in sessions. And, what we want is to be able to talk coherently to people who are making these decisions. Yeah, I'm glad you do that, Max. And you've been so good with public engagement and clarity all these years. And
I mentioned, I mentioned Robert Nozick earlier, and one of my favorite books actually in philosophy is Philosophical Explanations, where he talks about a whole different paradigm of philosophy. Instead of trying to prove things all the time, and he talks about the language where we're proving and forcing people to conclusions. Instead, he says we should think of philosophy more about how can things be possible. Let's look at possibilities, which is a lot less coercive kind of thinking. So I kind of like that approach.
Yeah, I really liked his framework for utopia in his other book. He was really inspiring. I also liked he and John Rawls alive and working at Harvard at the same time, producing these wonderful works of political philosophy that still inspire us.
That's still central to the discussion. Yeah.
Totally fascinating stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think we've kind of covered everything I had down. Is there anything in particular you'd like to add?
No, this was really great, Max. I'm really glad we finally got a chance to talk. Because, you and Natasha have been just so important to the transhumanist movement. And I know you've been thinking a lot about personal identity and now this work on cryogenics and all this stuff you guys are doing. I'm so excited. So, let's just keep it up.
Let's follow up.
I would really like that. Come out to Mindfest, speak sometime. It'd be great. I would love that.
That'd be great. I'll do that.
Yeah.
I do get to Florida occasionally, so it's not too hard to do.
Oh, well, let me know if you get in, and we can arrange something. I mean, we have so much that needs to be done in terms of these transhumanist issues. We really do. I always consider myself a transhumanist. I'm just one who's more critical of some of the more extreme views. But like I'm on board with a lot of it.
To be continued. I was actually
for
very pleased that you were kind of very above board about being a transhumanist in your book, because a lot of people kind of don't want to be associated. Oh, what will people think? But you were very upfront about that, so that was good.
Oh, for sure. And thanks for reading the book. I'm really honored that you took so much time in this busy world to read it. So, thanks.
It was very good. I recommend it. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad it was okay. Right. And thanks for your time, Max. Thanks for having me. And I'll talk to you soon, hopefully.
Yes. Thanks for being on.
Okay. All right.